Set into the wall of a medieval church in the Pyrenees are two doors. One is tall, framed by a stone arch, its carved ornament worn smooth by centuries. The other is low, half the height of a grown man, stripped of any decoration. The stone around it is rough, coarse under the palm, as though the builders wanted it to look like a mistake in the masonry, an afterthought best not noticed. For 600 years people entered through it, people despised by everyone around them. And no one, not the despised, not those who despised them, knew why. They were called Cagots. They lived on both sides of the Pyrenees, scattered in communities across Gascony, Béarn, Navarre, and the Basque country. They spoke the same language as their neighbors, prayed to the same God, attended the same churches, just not through the same door. In appearance, nothing set them apart, yet in every parish church, a separate baptismal font stood waiting for them, smaller, carved from stone, shoved into a corner, as though the water in it were meant for a different sort of soul. A Cagot was buried in a separate cemetery, behind the wall, closer to the edge, as far from the other dead as possible. Even Earth, it seemed, had to maintain the divide after death. Cagot children could not study alongside other children. A Cagot was forbidden to walk down the center of a street, only along the edge, yielding to anyone who passed. Forbidden to touch the railing of a bridge with bare hands, only through a rag, a sleeve, a scrap of cloth, as though Cagot skin carried something that must never reach a shared surface. Forbidden to drink from a common fountain, forbidden to walk barefoot, as if the ground itself could catch infection from the touch of their feet. The cascade of prohibitions swelled from village to village, century to century, and with every generation the rules grew finer, more exacting. In some communities, a Cagot was forbidden to appear at the market before noon. In others, forbidden to sell anything but wooden goods. In others still, forbidden to touch food on a stall before paying. The rules multiplied, passed down from generation to generation, parish to parish, but not one of them came with an explanation. No municipal act ever read, "because." Only the rule, only the boundary, only the wall. And so that the boundary could be seen from a distance, Cagots were required to sew a mark onto their clothing, a red patch in the shape of a goose's foot. Bright fabric against gray wool, visible from dozens of paces, so that a passerby could step aside in time, so that no one would accidentally come too close, accidentally make contact. Red on gray. Anyone who knows European history is already thinking of another badge, on other clothes, in another century. The Cagots were wearing theirs 500 years earlier. And through all of it, they still had to live, feed their children, earn their bread among people who turned away from them. Cagots were permitted to work only with wood, carpentry, cooperage, rope-making, and nothing else. Land, livestock, grain, iron, trade, stone, all of that belonged to the rest. What the Cagots had was timber, the scream of a plane biting into oak, the smell of fresh shavings, the weight of a beam across the shoulder, resin ground under the fingernails. And here, the first paradox impossible to pass over. Locked into a single craft, refining it generation after generation, the Cagots became the finest carpenters in the Pyrenees, the finest builders for miles around. They were called upon to raise houses, bridges, barns, church roofs. No one trusted their touch, but everyone trusted them with the weight of an entire building.
3 weeks after they had raised the rafters, they were not allowed through the same door as everyone else. But the most unsettling thing was the scale. This was not the quirk of a single remote village, not the superstition of some backwater parish forgotten on a mountainside.
Church registers from the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries surviving on both slopes of the Pyrenees, from Gascony to Navarre, recorded Cagots on a separate line, a separate column in the parish ledgers. Hundreds of communities, thousands of families, thousands of names entered apart. The system stretched across a territory the size of a small state. This was not a prejudice, it was an institution, not an opinion, a social order, not a tradition, a law. And if an institution is that consistent, that durable, that uniform across centuries, then it must have a foundation, a reason, a beginning. Historians searched for that foundation for centuries. They found several answers. Each sounded convincing. None survived scrutiny. The first trail seemed obvious: lepers. Medieval Europe lived in terror of leprosy. Whole quarters were sealed off, the sick driven beyond the city walls. And the rules imposed on the Cagots read like quarantine measures: a separate font, a separate cemetery, a ban on touching shared objects, a ban on going barefoot. Almost convincing, until anyone bothered to check. Across 600 years of documented history, not a single medical record, not a single leper hospital associated specifically with them, not one record of symptoms. A quarantine without a disease, isolation without an epidemic, a rule that outlived its cause by centuries, if the cause had ever existed at all. The second trail led through language. Some linguists derived the word Cagot from the Gascon Cagots, dog Goths, descendants of Visigoths who had settled in Aquitaine after the collapse of their kingdom in the 6th century. The Visigoths had been Arians, heretics in the eyes of the Catholic Church. They were hated for their faith, their foreign blood, a language their neighbors could not understand. The theory accounted for both the word and the hatred, outsiders whom the local population rejected and never forgave, even across centuries. Elegant, logical, almost flawless. But the Visigoths had fully assimilated long before the 13th century, adopting the local language, the local faith, local customs, local names. By the time Cagots first appear in the documents, nothing remained of a Gothic identity. The etymology may have survived, the people behind it had long since dissolved. The third trail led farther south and deeper. The Cathars, heretics of southern France, who believed the material world was the creation of an evil god. The church destroyed them with such ferocity that entire villages vanished from the map. Cagots lived precisely where Cathars had been most numerous, the same foothills, the same valleys, the same stone villages pressed against mountain slopes. The overlap seemed too precise to be coincidence. But Cagots were Christians. They attended church faithfully, if through the smaller door. They baptized their children, if in the separate font. Not a single trace of heresy. And the chronology did not hold. The stigma attached to the Cagots, judging by the earliest indirect evidence, predated the Crusade. The theory fell apart before it could take root. Yet while studying the church archives of these regions, researchers uncovered a detail that would later play its own role in this story, an unexpected one. Cagots were tracked in separate lists. Their names, marriages, births, and deaths were recorded in special sections of the parish registers, apart from all other parishioners. Entire lineages assembled by another's hand, generation after generation. These records were kept for centuries.
What became of those records comes later, but what became of them would change the entire picture. The last trail led beyond the Pyrenees, Saracens, descendants of Muslims who had remained on the Iberian Peninsula after the Arab withdrawal. Arabs had indeed been present in these mountains, building fortresses, laying roads, garrisoning passes. Cagots were found precisely where Arab trade routes ran up against the high passes, where the Moors had lingered longest before retreating. The overlap seemed too precise to be coincidence.
The theory explained both the geography and the hatred, a foreign faith, foreign blood, a foreign tongue, even generations later. Until anyone looked closely at the language. Cagots did not speak Arabic, did not pray differently, had not preserved a single custom, a single word, a single household object pointing to a different origin. Nothing, not a single thread to pull. 4 trails, 4 explanations, and not one survived the test. For 600 years, people had asked the same question: who were the Cagots? The answer, when it came, would destroy the question itself. In the early 21st century, geneticists took DNA samples from the descendants of those who had once been recorded as Cagots and compared them to the surrounding population of the Pyrenees. The result was brutally simple. It changed everything, not because it answered the question, but because it showed there had never been anything there to find. No differences, none whatsoever. The same genetic markers, the same haplogroups, the same ancestors. Cagots and their neighbors were the same people. They had always been the same people, identical to the neighbors from whom they had been separated by a wall with no foundation. The geneticists had expected to find something, a marker, a trace, a reason. There was nothing. Which meant the question was never about who the Cagots were. It was about something else entirely. It is no longer who were they, it is how hatred works without a basis. 600 years, with no ethnic difference, no religious schism, no language barrier, no single objective trait distinguishing one group from the other, only an entry in a book, only a line in a register. Perhaps a reason was never required. Perhaps all hatred needs is a category, a separate column in a ledger, an entry that outlives those who made it. All it takes is for someone once to draw a line, and for everyone after to go on respecting it, because it had already been drawn. But if a reason is not required, what kept this machine running for 600 years? What compelled each new generation to reproduce prohibitions that no one could any longer explain? The answer was simpler than any theory of origin, and harder to bear. The year 1680. A Pyrenean village. A child is born. The priest opens the parish register, looks at the father's name, and writes Cagot. Not because the child is sick, not because the child has done anything wrong, because his father was recorded as a Cagot, and his father's father. No one in that chain knew why the first of them had received the entry, but the entry existed, and that was enough. The community saw the entry and knew. The community kept its distance. Children grew up Cagots because that was what the record said. Their children were entered in the same column, and on without end. No one asked why. The register answered for them. Here is the line, here is the name, here is the category. That was enough. There was no original accusation. There was no moment when someone pronounced the verdict aloud. There was only inertia, repeating itself across centuries like an echo in a stone nave.
a sound whose source had vanished long ago, while its reflection still wandered the cold walls. And the longer it lasted, the less anyone thought to ask where the sound had come from. Its very existence seemed proof that it ought to exist. Hatred did not need a reason. It needed only paper.
The Cagots tried to break the cycle. They drafted petitions to the King of Navarre, to the Parliament of Béarn, to the Papal Court in Rome. For decades they wrote, pleaded, demonstrated that they were no different from anyone else. In 1514, Pope Leo X issued a bull declaring Cagots equal to all other Christians, full equality, confirmed by the highest authority in the Catholic world. The text was clear, the language unambiguous, an order from God's vicar on earth to be carried out immediately. On the ground, it was ignored, completely. Not a single parish priest removed the separate column from the register. Not a single community lifted a ban. Not a single municipality struck down the rules governing the road, the bridge, and the fountain. The low door stayed low. The font stayed in the corner. The red goosefoot stayed on the clothing. A document signed in Rome proved weaker than a habit embedded in the stonework of a Pyrenean village. The Pope could proclaim equality. The village decided otherwise. Others chose not to petition, but to act. The 1460s, Béarn. A group of Cagots chose a gesture that seemed the simplest thing in the world, to walk into a church through the main door. No revolt, no weapons, no ultimatum, just people who decided to pass where everyone else passed. A Sunday morning, stone steps polished by hundreds of feet, the tall door open for parishioners. The court records tell us what happened. One of the Cagots had his hand cut off. The hand he worked with, the hand that held his tools, the hand that may have built that very church. It was that hand he laid on the sun-warmed wood of the main entrance. For that touch, they cut off his hand. Because the Cagot carpenters built the very churches, they were forbidden to enter through the front door. They raised the rafters, hewed the beams, set the frames, carved the lintels and the jambs. They knew every knot in the timbers that would hold the roof above the heads of those who despised them. They built both doors, the tall one arched and carved for the rest, and the low one bare for themselves. The smell of fresh wood that soaked into their palms seeped into the walls of a church where no seat among the congregation was meant for them. They finished the work, swept the shavings from the stone floor, gathered their tools, and left through the small door, ducking so as not to strike their heads. A man whose hands held up the building had no right to touch the door handle of that building. Skill did not save anyone from the stigma. It existed inside the stigma, like a tree growing through a crack in rock. And the stronger the tree grew, the more visible the crack became. The 18th century wore the system down slowly from outside. The Enlightenment made the crudest prohibitions indecent on paper. Philosophers wrote about equality. Laws were formally relaxed. In some towns, Cagots were permitted to buy land, but neighbors refused to sell. In others, the obligation to wear the red goosefoot was lifted, but the mark was no longer necessary. Everyone already knew who was who. Stigma does not live in law. It lives in memory, in habit, in the inflection of a voice, in the way a neighbor averts his eyes when you pass his house. The registers still held the names. The columns still existed. The Cagots waited.
not for a new decree, for something that would break not the letter of the law, but the very structure that reproduced their brand from one generation to the next. In 1789, it came, revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. All are equal, all estates abolished, all privileges annulled. For the first time in 6 centuries, the Cagots received full civil rights, without conditions, without separate fonts, without the smaller door. One might have expected that the first thing they would do was walk into a church through the main entrance, throw open the door that had been closed to them for 600 years. But the Cagots did something else. The first thing they did, upon receiving their freedom, was not to walk through the main door. They went to the archives. Across the villages of Béarn, Navarre, and Gascony, Cagots descended on church storerooms. They did not loot. They did not burn altars. They did not take the silver. They were looking for one thing: the registers. The parish ledgers in which their names had stood in a separate column for 600 years. Thick notebooks in leather bindings, smelling of damp, candle racks, and cellar mold. Notebooks in which for generations it had been recorded who was a Cagot and who was not. They pulled them from cupboards, from chests, from stone niches where the books had been stacked for decades, and burned them. Right in the church courtyards. Smoke rose above the stone walls. Flakes of charred paper, gray, weightless, spiraled through the air and settled on doorsteps, on the cobblestones, on the shoulders of those standing nearby. The ink that had spelled out their names for centuries turned to soot and settled on the very palms that fed the flames. The Cagots were not destroying someone else's history. They were destroying their own lineages, their own names, their own records of birth, marriage, and death. 600 years of documented existence, an entire epic of suffering, turned to ash. They demanded no acknowledgement. They waited for no apology. They sought no witnesses. The sole documentary trace of 6 centuries of injustice, and they destroyed it. Anyone else in their place would have preserved those books as testimony, as an indictment, as a monument. The Cagots did the opposite. And in that, there was a logic, cold, precise, surgical. A register is not a record. A register is a mechanism. As long as the list exists, the category exists. As long as the category exists, the past can become a verdict again. You can proclaim equality. You can tear down a wall. But if somewhere in a church basement there lies a book recording that you are different, then someday someone will open it. Some priest, some official, some neighbor looking for a reason, and the wall will return. To destroy the list was to destroy not the past, but the future of repetition, not vengeance, not despair, an attempt to rip out the very root of the disease.
It worked. The Cagots vanished. Not as people, as a category. By the middle of the 19th century, no one was registered as a Cagot any longer. No one sewed the red goosefoot onto their clothing. No one entered through the low door. The descendants of Cagots married the children of those who had shunned them for centuries. They blended, they dissolved, they changed their surnames. They moved to neighboring villages where no one knew them. Within 2 generations, it was no longer possible to say with certainty who had been a Cagot and who had not. Without the register, there was nothing to hold on to. Today, no one in the Pyrenees calls themselves a Cagot. There is no community, no identity, no heirs to this history, no one to tell 6 centuries from the inside,
No one to show the scar. The books were burned, and with them the memory of those the books had marked.
But something survived the fire. In the mountain villages of the Pyrenees, the word Cagot is still sometimes spoken aloud, not as a historical term, as an insult, a reflex of contempt whose precise meaning the speaker has long forgotten, though its force remains untouched. Old people in certain villages still remember which families lived on that side of the cemetery. They remember but do not say, or say only in a whisper, as though the knowledge itself were dangerous. The stigma outlived those it branded. The word outlived the Cagots themselves. The verdict is gone. The echo remains. And yet, of that history, more survives in stone than in memory. The paper was burned. The stone remained. In the village of Ourt, in the foothills, there stands an old church. It has one door, tall, ordinary, its arch darkened with age. The second has been bricked up, but the outline is still visible. Its arch is lower, its opening narrower. The stone in that spot is a slightly different shade, a touch lighter, a touch smoother than the centuries-old masonry around it. The door was sealed, but its trace remained. That is how hatred works. The cause disappears first. The trace remains.